Episode 43. Cabaret of Death. Shelled by Friend and Foe by Captain E.J. Needham. Read by Michael Charter. In one of the most vivid narratives ever written of early fighting in the Ypres salient, Captain Needham of the Northamptonshire Regiment here tells of a day and night of bloody battle in the neighbourhood of the Kortekeek Cabaret and of Langemarck and Poelcappelle. These villages, later known as mangled and unrecognizable ruins, in 1914 still retain their red roofs and church steeples. October 22nd, 1914, I found the battalion lining a railway embankment about a quarter of a mile out of the village of Langemarck. I asked what had happened and was told that the Germans had attacked the 1st Brigade, who were holding the line in front of the road running between Langemarck and Steenstraat, and the line to their left, which was held by dismounted French cavalry. The latter, having no entrenching tools of any description, had been unable to dig themselves in, and were soon driven out of the line. The Huns had occupied this and had inflated the left of the 1st Brigade held by the Cameron Highlanders, who in turn were driven out of their trenches. Heavy fighting in this neighbourhood was still going on. We stayed on the railway bank for about an hour and then got our orders to return to Needham, but to hold ourselves in readiness to move at very short notice. We marched back, and just as we arrived at the village, the head of the battalion halted. We could see the brigade commander, General Bulfin, and his brigade major in conversation with the colonel. Presently, the colonel rode back to us and told us we had to return immediately to take back the trenches lost by the Camerons. C Company was to lead the way, and I was told, not at all to my satisfaction, that I was to go ahead with the point of the advance guard, taking every possible precaution, as nobody knew just where the line was, or just where the Camerons were, or the enemy. It was now pitch dark. In fact, one of the darkest nights I have ever known in my life. It was impossible to see more than the yard in front. I think that for the next half an hour or so, I was more thoroughly frightened than any other time during the war. Moving up a lane in the inky darkness, not knowing where one was going, but only that somewhere ahead was the enemy, waiting for us. We moved along the ditches on each side of the road, so as not to give away our advance by the sound of our feet tramping along the hard surface of the lane. After going 2 kilometres, suddenly from the left-hand side of the road came a loud "Halt! Qui va là?" As soon as I recovered from the shock of the sudden challenge in the dark, I called back, "Amis anglais, passez-vous mes amis?" called back the French sentry, who I could just make out standing outside a small cottage. On we went, thankful to have been challenged instead of shot at first and challenged afterwards. After 2 kilometres or so, we heard footsteps coming down the road. I promptly halted my men and passed the word back to halt the rest of the advance guard and the main body, and waited till the footsteps sounded quite close. Then I called out, "Halt! Who goes there?" A voice answered, "Medical officer, Cameron Highlanders, with Captain Cameron badly wounded." "Who are you?" I told him and asked where the Germans were. He told me that about a kilometre further on was a crossroad, and that if we turned to the left there, we should find the remnants of the Camerons about 800 yards up that road, and that the Germans were about 400 yards beyond them again. I thanked him, and on we went again. Presently we heard the rumble and rattle of horse transport to our right, and shortly afterwards we reached the crossroads, and there, just arrived at them, was a whole lot of horse transport. I asked them who they were, and they replied they were the 1st Brigade to 1st Line transport. I asked if they were aware the Germans were only about 1,000 yards away, and they said they hadn't the slightest idea of it. I told them they had better stay where they were and keep as quiet as possible until our colonel came up, and then ask him for orders. They were very lucky to arrive there just when they did, and we did, for otherwise they would have ridden right into the Germans, or at any rate to within a few hundred yards of them, and they would have been heard and fired upon with disastrous consequences, as the lane was much too narrow for them to have turned round and retired. We marched on once more, still keeping to the ditches at the side of the road, and some minutes later we were suddenly challenged again, in a very Scotch accent. They proved to be the sentry over the Camerons' headquarters, a farmhouse, in and around which were the remains of their battalion. I told him who we were and asked for an officer. One soon appeared and told me that we must keep very quiet, as the enemy were quite close by, along a road running at right angles to the one we were on, about 300 or 400 yards ahead. This officer went down the road to speak to Colonel Osborne Smith and to tell him the situation. In the meantime, we stayed where we were. Very shortly afterwards, we heard loud shouting, cheering and singing in front of us, which we gathered was the merry Hun disporting himself after a victory of the afternoon. After waiting about half an hour, Bentley, a company commander, came up to me and said that C Company were to extend across the field to the right of the road, advance towards the enemy and drive them out of their positions with D Company on our right. Shortly afterwards, the rest of the company came filing up the ditch and then out to the right across the fields. They were followed by D Company, who carried out the same manoeuvre. Presently the word was passed down from the right for both companies to advance, and off we went, stumbling over turnips, trying to keep in touch with the man on our right and left, and utterly unable to see anything. Suddenly, heavy firing broke out on our right, and we heard cries of alarm, accompanied apparently by much guttural cursing to our front. A few bullets started to come our way, so we lay down and fired 5 rounds rapid into the darkness to our immediate front, and then charged, yelling at the tops of our voices. We arrived at the road to find the enemy gone and promptly started to dig ourselves in as hard as we could. After a while, Bentley came along and sent me back to try to find one platoon that had got lost in the dark. I wandered off, edging away to my right, presently came to the lane we had left in the ditch, of which I found half a company of Coldstream Guards. During all this time, heavy fighting was going on to our right, where D Company were attacking a mill. Just about the time Russell, a fellow subaltern, and I reached our line. The mill was captured and our machine guns were installed in place of the Germans. Things now quietened down, and we were able to dig in peace. I spent the whole night walking up and down our line, very cold and very hungry. We had all gone supperless, as we had moved out of Pilkem too early, and it was quite impossible for the cookers to come up anywhere near us. And even if they had, it would be impossible for carrying parties to find our lines in the intense darkness. Just before dawn, we were able to make out a small cottage immediately in front of C Company's line. We sent out a patrol under a sergeant to find out if it was occupied, and they returned presently to say that they had found a dead body of a man stark naked, but for his identity disc around his neck, a private in the Cameron Highlanders. The Huns had evidently made off with his kit and accoutrements, and no doubt some Hun had a wonderful souvenir to send home in the shape of our unfortunate man's kilt. We stood to for about a quarter of an hour, and then C Company were ordered to occupy some trenches to the right, about 150 yards in front of the road which the Camerons had just been driven out of the evening before. Just before we stood to, a terrific outbreak of firing on our left broke out. I must explain that at the junction of the lane stood an inn called the Kortekeek Cabaret, and this was strongly held by the enemy. On the side of the road on which we spent the night, and about 400 yards east of the inn, stood the mill which D Company had attacked and captured during the night. This outbreak of fighting heralded a strong attack by A Company in conjunction with some of the Camerons on the inn, and was successful insofar as they got right up to the inn, but the opposition was too strong for them, the Germans having a large number of men and many machine guns in it, so that our troops had to retire with heavy losses. Shortly after, C Company had moved without loss or trouble to its new position. The terrible news came along to us that poor old Russell had been killed in the attack. I was frightfully cut up about this. Russell had been one of my best friends in the old days at the depot. He was one of the nicest fellows I've ever known. We all got busy trying to improve our now so-called trenches, which were really nothing more than a narrow ditch about 2 feet wide and a yard deep. We were now immediately in front of the mill, and very shortly after we took our position, to our horror, our guns started to shell it. We sent back messages to battalion headquarters, asked them to let the gunners know we were in front of the mill, but the shelling continued, and presently the Germans started to shell it too. So now we were in a lovely predicament. We were collecting all the German shorts and our own gunners' overs, and could do nothing but lie at the bottom of a ditch shivering and cursing with fear and sending messages back at intervals to try and get our gunners to give their attention elsewhere. The double shelling continued on and off the whole day, and we had several casualties from it. About 9 or 10 o'clock the Queens came up, advancing through the Camerons and the remains of A Company, and attacked the inn, with the 60th and Loyal North Lancashire attacking on their left. This time the attack was successful, the inn being captured together with about 300 Germans, many more of them being killed. After this the morning dragged on, fine but coldish. The mill continued to be bombarded by both sides, and heavy firing was going on to my right all the time, where the 1st Brigade were heavily engaged. In front of C Company the ground, a field of roots, sloped away down to a little stream of the Hannebeek, the banks of which were clearly defined by the pollarded willows. Behind this stream again the ground sloped upwards, gradually to small woods stretching along a low ridge. The stream was about 350 yards in front of us, and the wood another 400 yards behind that. To our right front, and about a mile away, stood a church and the red-roofed houses of Langemarck, and beyond that again, at about the same distance away from it, the church and roofs of Poelcappelle. No food had come up during the morning, not even our usual tea and rum, and we had to fall back on our iron rations of bully beef and biscuits. About 1 p.m. we could see large bodies of Germans collecting up in the wood on the ridge opposite, and Jumbo Bentley and I knelt up in our ditch so able to better see what they were up to, and both scanned the wood closely through our field glasses. Suddenly I felt a terrible blow on my right arm, just as somebody had hit me on the funny bone as hard as they could with a sledgehammer. It spun me around like a top, and I collapsed in the bottom of the trench. The man next to me rolled over and said, "You ain't half bloody well got it in the hand, sir." And I looked on down. I saw my right hand was a mass of blood. My arm still felt numb from the blow, and I could hardly realize that it was my hand that was hit, as it did not hurt at all. However, the man cut my field dressing out of my tunic, and after dousing my hand with iodine, which did hurt, he bound it up very well. He then made a sling out of my woolen scarf which I was wearing, insisting on giving me one of his own cigarettes and lighting it for me, and told me not to worry, I was for a blighty. All right with that packet. This sounded too good to be true, and I felt distinctly better. He also said, and I realized it for the first time, that I'd been very lucky not to be killed, as I had my field glasses up to my eyes, and the bullet, which had hit my right hand, would have got me in the head if I had been 1 inch further to the left. He told me my right collar badge was badly dented, and the bullet must have hit this after hitting my hand. About 5 minutes after I was hit, a man 2 away from me on the left, kneeling up, looking out towards the German when he was shot straight through the head. We came to the conclusion there must be snipers lying in one of the pollarded willows by the stream, about 350 yards in front of us, and that they must be pretty hot shots. Anyhow, Bentley gave orders that no man was to expose himself from now onwards unless we were attacked. All this time, shells from both sides kept dropping on and around the unfortunate mill, which was now on fire in several places. I suppose it was the after effects of the shock of being hit, but anyhow my nerves were completely shot. I lay in the bottom of the trench, expecting the Huns to come over and wipe me out lying defenceless. Or I began to panic that instead of going home with a nice wound, a shell would land in the trench and blow me up. I lay and sweated with a funk, and the further the afternoon drew on, the worse my nerves got. It was impossible with that damn sniper in front of me to get out of the trench and walk over the open fields to the dressing station. The only thing I could do was lie where I was until nightfall, and then to make a bolt for it and pray that the Hun did not attack us before that. About 4 o'clock we could hear much singing and cheering from the enemy's direction, and this continued for the next 2 hours. This did not cheer me up, as we all decided it was the Hun cheering himself up before making an attack on us. At last it started to get dark, and at 6 o'clock I said goodbye to Bentley, wished him all the best of luck in the world, and scrambled out of the ditch, ran across to the road behind us where I found Cartwright and D Company in the ditch. I stopped for a minute to tell him what had happened to me, then said goodbye and bolted round the back of the mill on a short cut from where Cartwright told me the battalion headquarters was on the lane running to Belcombe. The man who'd bound up my hand insisted on coming back with me and carrying my pack and equipment. As we passed the mill, the whole top fell in, and huge columns of smoke and flame shot up towards the sky, illuminating the ground all around over a very big area and, of course, silhouetting us both clearly. Never before or since in my life have I run so fast. It seemed miles to the road, but at last we arrived there blowing and wheezing and hurled ourselves into a ditch. I found the Colonel and Guy Robinson reporting myself wounded, and was most kindly spoken to by the Colonel, who wished me the best of luck and was very kind enough to say he will miss me very much. They were both most kind and considerate, and told me I should find the dressing station in the cottage along the lane where the French sentry had challenged us the night before. While we were talking, a terrific outburst of gun and rifle fire from the Germans broke out all along the line, as at once answered by our men. Shells started to burst all around, and spent bullets to ping their way past me. The Colonel told me I'd better be off as quickly as I could go, as the Germans were evidently going to attack. So I said goodbye to them, and, accompanied by my faithful volunteer Batman, fairly legged it down the lane. On and on we ran, expecting every minute to be our last, as shells were bursting all around, but at last we got to the crossroads where we had stopped the 1st Brigade's transport the night before, and turning to the right found ourselves out of the zone of fire. We arrived at the cottage. I went in, saw an open door on the left of the entrance passage, and an M.O. attending to a wounded man in the room. I told him who I was, my regiment, and that I was wounded, and asked him if Captain Lochran, our M.O., was about. "Oh, yes," he said. "You will find him in the room opposite." I thanked him, crossed the passage, opened the door opposite, and I found to my horror Paul Lochran stretched out on the floor, dead. To this day I cannot imagine why the M.O., who must have known he was dead, ever let me, wounded as I was, walk in on all that was left of poor old Lochran like that. It gave me an awful shock, and I fairly bolted out of the place and down the lane. We passed some Tommies at the entrance to the village, and asked them if there was another dressing station there, and they told me there was another in the village school. We found this. Inside the schoolroom the floor was strewn with straw, and in the middle of it were 2 deal tables on trestles. On these were laid out the various badly wounded men being attended to by the doctors who were working in their shirt sleeves. All around the tables on the straw-covered floor lay wounded men. The room was stacked with them. An orderly found me in the corner somewhere, and I lay down, feeling completely exhausted after all the panic, shocks and excitements of the afternoon. I lay there from 7:15 p.m. till 10:30 p.m. The whole time wounded men were being taken out and fresh wounded were coming in, and operations including amputations of legs and arms were being performed on the trestle tables. How different from the cleanliness and orderly organisation and discipline of the operating theatre in the hospital was the scene in that schoolroom. On the walls, maps and pictures of animals and birds, easels and blackboards along the walls. At the tables stood RAMC orderlies holding candles stuck in wine bottles to light the shirt-sleeve surgeon at their task. They worked quickly, noiselessly, and efficiently, without fuss or bother about this awful condition for such work. They were so kind and gentle to the unfortunate men on whom they worked, and most of them were in terrible agony.